Chapter 1. The Night of Raikta. The chill of early winter clung to the pines and earth like a jealous ghost, mist weaving through the tangled woods that spread like cracked veins around Raikta. As the sun drowned behind slate clouds, casting a dull silver pallor across the land, the iron-clad rider crested the final hill, overlooking his ancestral keep. Sir Theobald Kruger, broad-shouldered, stern-eyed, and forged in the fires of a dozen campaigns, surveyed the lands of his birth. The thick scar across his left cheek pulled as he frowned. The Reik River churned black and sluggish beyond the skeletal forest, and the stone towers of Krugerhole stood stoic against the encroaching wild, their banners limp in the windless dusk. The keep was not large, but it was old, older than most remembered, and carried the weary dignity of age that had resisted time, raiders, and worse. Beside him, the great destrier snorted. Magnar, a stallion of jet-black muscle and noble bearing, pawed the ground with a hoof the size of a tankard. His eyes were deep, intelligent, aware. A warhorse bred in Altdorf's holy stables, trained among fire and thunder, a gift from the Grand Theogonist after the Battle of Three Witches, when Theobald broke the Chaos Line and slew a demon prince atop the ruins of St. Ulbrich's Chapel. Magnar had carried him through hellfire, over mangled corpses, and through blizzards of screaming arrows. Horse and knight, bound by duty, faith, and blood. As Theobald rode through the open gates, old retainers bowed low. The air was thick with smoke from the hearths. Inside the bailey, soldiers drilled with dull clanks and shouts, but something, though he could not name it yet, felt amiss. That night, Theobald sat alone in the long hall. Tapestries of past glories hung in the firelight, depictions of Kruger ancestors slaying orcs, fending off Bretonnian knights, purging mutant dens. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant stamping of hooves in the stables. He drank bitter Raiklander brandy, hand resting lightly on the pommel of his sheathed sword. Grim him. Outside, the mist had grown denser, pressing against the stained-glass windows like pale fingers. By morning, Magnar was gone. The stables were in disarray, hay scattered, one wooden beam cracked clean through, splinters like spears. Theobald stood silently, eyes narrowed, as stablemaster Rolf babbled excuses. No sign of a struggle, no broken locks. The stallion had vanished, as if stolen by ghosts, except for the blood. A single smear of dark red on the stall door, not enough for a fatal wound, but enough to chill Theobald's blood. Then the hoofprints. They led out of the stable-yard, iron-rimmed impressions pressed deep into the earth, unnaturally wide apart, as though Magnar had galloped at full speed. But no tracks led to the stable, only away from it. Half a mile out, the trail veered into the Drakwald. The trees there grew closer together, thick with rot and darkness. The mist curled low, like breath from a dying god. Theobald dismounted his spare horse, an old gelding named Hearth, and knelt near the prince. A single horseshoe, shattered, lay embedded in the mud like a broken fang. It was Magnar's. But something was wrong. The hoofprints, they twisted. The rear ones had unnatural indentations, as if the hoofs had warped, stretching, clawing at the ground rather than stamping it. A low, almost imperceptible hum droned from the forest beyond. Not sound, not quite. A feeling. A pressure behind the eyes. Theobald's hand drifted to Grimhim. He turned back only once. Halt stood silent and still, its towers like tombstones beneath the gray sky. The soldiers didn't stir. Even the birds had gone quiet. Something had taken Magnar. Not a thief, nor a rival knight. Something older. Something fouler. He stepped into the mist, drawn by blood and hoofprint. Alone. And the forest swallowed him whole. Chapter 2. Tracks of the Damned. The mist hung low like a funeral shroud, muting color and deadening sound. Theobald Kruger moved through the Drakwald like a steel ghost, his heavy boots squelching through damp leaves, every step pressing deeper into rot and shadow. The hoofprints, magnars, or what remained of them, were still visible in the forest floor, spaced too far apart, the angles unnatural. What had once been a warhorse's noble gait was now twisted into something frantic and unclean. The trees closed in the deeper he went. Ancient trunks, bark slick with moss and dotted with oozing fungal blooms, loomed like sentinels. Faces seemed to leer in the bark, real or imagined, Theobald couldn't say. Once, he caught the glint of something metallic nailed to a tree. Closer inspection revealed a horse's jawbone, wired with rusted iron, teeth still blood-stained. He rode hard only so far before the underbrush grew too dense. Then he continued on foot, sword strapped across his back, a lantern held aloft. Cold sweat prickled beneath his breastplate despite the chill. The stench of damp earth, rot, and something vaguely coppery hung in the air. By midday he found the clearing. It was a scorched circle, perhaps 15 paces across, carved into the earth like a wound. Around the edges the grass had burned black, curled and dead. Symbols etched in crude lines of blood spanned the ground, blasphemous sigils, jagged spirals, and figures that resembled neither man nor beast. In the center was a twisted effigy, a crude figure of straw, bone, and horsehair. Its head was the skull of a colt, mounted backward. Blood, some dry, some still sticky, drenched the ground beneath it. Horsehair, unmistakably black and braided, hung from its arms like tendons. Theobald knelt beside the sigils, jaw tightening. Chaos! The marks were not of any common cult, no worship of the dark pantheon that he recognized, but something older, wilder, a primal veneration of transformation and beast. Then came the whisper, a crackle of leaves. He turned with a hiss, blade drawn in an instant. But the forest behind him was empty. Only the trees watched. "You're walking in cursed shoes, Knight," came a voice, rough, low, broken like gravel underfoot. From the shadows emerged a hunched figure, wrapped in furs and bark, hair matted with filth and feathers. His eyes were mismatched, one pale blue, the other milky white. His beard was wild, filled with twigs, and clutched in one gnarled hand was a staff made from a twisted deer spine. A knight of the Empire. The hermit spat with bitter amusement. "Armor won't shield your soul here." Theobald stepped forward, voice hard. "Speak. What was done here? Who performed this rite?" The hermit's laugh was not sane. "You've found their altar, the horned path. Yes, they walk again. They've always walked, in the hidden glades under moon and bone. The horned path." Theobald's blade didn't lower. "Chaos cultists?" "Not like the others," the hermit muttered, pacing the edge of the burned circle. "Not gods of man. These worship the old change, the primal form. Beast before man, man before thought. They wear the skin of animals, speak to hoofs, dance on 4 legs beneath Morsleep's eye." The knight glanced to the ritual circle again. "They took my horse." The hermit stopped. For a moment, the madness in his eyes receded. "The black one," he whispered. "Yes, they want the blood of noble beasts. Strength, grace, loyalty. They twist it, break it, feed it to the woods." He turned and pointed deeper into the trees. "There's a path, not on any map. You'll see bones in the branches, a gate of horns. That's where they took it. But beware, knight. They don't kill what they take. They change it." Theobald's stomach turned at the word. He nodded once and turned, stepping away from the circle. The hermit remained behind, muttering prayers or curses he could not tell. As Theobald followed the trail anew, deeper into the Drakwald, he noticed the hoofprints had changed again, larger now, and the edges of each print cloven. Chapter 3. The Witch Hunter's Warning. Kruger had never felt colder. The fire in the great hall spat and hissed, but its warmth did not reach Theobald Kruger as he stood before it, staring into the dancing flames as if they might part and show him the truth. His armor was still splashed with dried mud from the forest, blood flecks from some half-seen creature that had lunged at him in the brush, clinging stubbornly to the grooves of his gauntlets. His eyes, red-rimmed and sleepless, were locked in a storm of thought. The door groaned open behind him. Boots rang out on the stone floor, precise, deliberate. Not the unsure steps of a servant, nor the heavy gait of his guards. These steps bore purpose. He turned slowly. A woman stood in the archway, her black leather coat draped like a shadow about her tall frame. A broad-brimmed hat shaded her eyes, but not the sharp lines of her face, carved as if from ice. High cheekbones, a hawk-like nose, lips pressed in permanent judgment. Around her neck hung a silver hammer sigil, worn and grimy from use. A sword with a runed hilt hung at her side, and on her belt pouches, vials, and a flintlock etched with words of Sigmarite or Adelind Volkmar, a witch-hunter of the Order of the Silver Flame. "You've been followed," she said without preamble. Theobald didn't move. "Who are you?" She removed her hat, revealing a braid the color of old iron coiled tight against her head. "Witch-hunter Volkmar. I rode from Altdorf under sealed writ. I've been hunting a trail of rot across the Reichwald and beyond. It ends here. I'm not in the habit of welcoming strangers into my hall unannounced." "You're in no position to protest," she replied coldly. "You've already seen the signs. The burnt circle, the hoof prints, the blood." He said nothing. She stepped forward, boots leaving faint streaks of water on the stone. "The cult of the Horned Path. They've operated in secret for decades, centuries perhaps, scattered, bestial, more pagan than devout. But something has changed." Theobald clenched his jaw. "They took my horse." She nodded once. "Magnar." "Yes, I've heard of the beast. A noble line, tied to sacred lineage. They desire such purity, not to worship, but to profane. These cultists believe the path to power lies not in serving chaos directly, but in becoming like the beasts they venerate, infusing men, steed, and Daemon into a singular entity." The fire cracked sharply. Theobald stared, grimacing. "They breed filth in hidden glades," she continued. "Sacrifice animals and people alike to their blasphemies. They wear skins of wolves, dance in stag blood, and brand their own flesh with symbols meant to fracture their souls. But that's not the worst." She reached into her coat and withdrew a piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle, smeared with what might have been bile. She laid it on the table between them. It showed a diagram, twisted and sprawling, of a ritual circle much like the one Theobald had found, but in its center, bound by chains drawn in red ink, was the crude depiction of a horse. Not just any horse, a warhorse, adorned in imperial barding. "They've learned to bind demon spirits to beasts of war," Erlindi said. "Steeds of nobility are the most prized. They see them as pure vessels they can corrupt." Theobald's fists curled. "Why not take a man?" "They do," she said. "But horses are more obedient, easier to shape." Theobald turned away, face darkening with fury. "I will raise the forest. I'll put them all to the sword." Volkmar's voice cut like flint. "You'll die if you do it alone. They aren't just madmen. They've learned rituals forbidden even in the darkest libraries of Null. Some of them are no longer truly human. Then I'll cut them down just the same." "I don't doubt that," she said. "But rage will blind you, and these cults thrive in shadows." Silence fell. The fire snapped again. Then Volkmar stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There is a place, south of the river. Old ruins once belonging to the Order of the Golden Stag. It was razed during the Beastman uprising 50 years ago. Now it's a blighted hole, a breeding ground for vermin, beast, and worse." Theobald's eyes locked onto hers. "They're hiding there?" She nodded. "That's where they took your horse. And if they complete the rite, Magnar will be lost, utterly transformed. You won't be facing a steed. You'll be facing a Daemon on hooves, wrapped in the skin of something you once loved." Theobald turned back to the fire, its light dancing across his polished breastplate. The air grew heavier, the smoke thicker. "I will bring flame to that ruin," he whispered, "and bury them in it." Volkmar's lips curled into the faintest of grim smiles. "Then we ride at dawn." Chapter 4. Hoofbeats in the Ruins. The wind bit sharp against their faces as Theobald and Adelinde approached the ruins of Fort Eisenwacht, the skeletal remains of the old outpost rising through the morning mist like the jagged vertebrae of some long-dead colossus. Blackened stone jutted from the earth in crumbled towers and fallen walls, overgrown with thorned ivy and twisted vines that wept sap the color of spoiled wine. The ground was soft with rot and moss, yet every footstep felt too loud in the silence. Once a proud bastion of the Empire, Eisenwacht had stood sentinel on the southern fringe of Reichstadt's border until the beastmen razed it in a night of blood and screaming. No one had dared reclaim it. Even the scavengers gave it a wide berth. Now it reeked of sorcery. As they dismounted and led their steeds behind a shattered wall, Theobald caught sight of bones scattered like discarded kindling, some animal, some very much human. Each bore strange carvings, symbols etched deep into the marrow with something jagged and cruel. Adelinde examined one fragment, a femur, and muttered a curse. "They're fresh," she said, flicking her cloak aside and drawing her flintlock. 3 days old, maybe less." Theobald gripped Grinhim, his bastard sword heavy in his hand. "Then they're still here." They moved deeper into the ruins, stepping over broken masonry, shattered weapons, and old bloodstains turned brown with age. An ancient chapel loomed ahead, its roof collapsed, its Sigmarite statues defaced and toppled. The stone altar within had been smeared with dried gore, and a chain of vertebrae dangled from the rafters, spinning gently in the wind, like a child's mobile. And then came the sound. Hoofbeats. But not from a single horse. No, this was heavier, wrong. It echoed strangely as if the stone itself recoiled from the rhythm. Theobald froze, raising his blade, just as a figure stepped from the shadows between two ruined archways. A man, bare-chested, pale, his skin painted in tar and blood. A ram skull covered his face, and hooked iron pierced his arms, shoulders, even his tongue, which lolled grotesquely from the side of the mask. He carried a cleaver too large to be practical, engraved with swirling runes that glowed faintly with a sickly green light. 3 more emerged behind him. One wore a boar's head helm, the next had a belt of stitched-together squirrel pelts and wielded a rusted spear, still wet at the tip. The last was hunched, cloaked in a mangled bearskin, dragging a flail fashioned from horse bones. They did not speak. They charged. Theobald surged forward with a roar, meeting the first cultist in a crash of steel and flesh. Grimhim cleaved through the man's shoulder, splitting him to the chest. The masked zealot collapsed with a wet gasp, his cleaver clattering to the stones. Then he fired, The flintlock barked with fire and smoke, and the boar-maked cultist's head snapped back in a fountain of gore. But the others kept coming, shrieking like animals. Theobald blocked the spear with his vambrace, the rusted tip scraping along steel with a shriek, and drove his gauntlet into the attacker's throat. Bone crunched. He followed with a boot to the knee that bent the limb sideways, then spun and cut the man down in one clean arc. Blood sprayed the altar behind them, mixing with the old stains. The bearskin cultist swung his flail at Adelinde, who ducked low, drew her short sword, and opened the man's belly from hip to sternum. Entrails spilled like black sausages, steaming in the cold air. He dropped without a sound. But the hoofbeats returned. From the chapel's collapsed nave it emerged. A figure riding a steed. Or something, once a steed. It might have been a horse once. Now it was a creature of blasphemous design. Its hide was flayed, pulsing muscle exposed beneath blackened veins that wriggled like worms. Its hoofs were split, cloven like a goat's, but they struck sparks from stone as it charged. The rider wore no armor, only a cloak of stitched skin and a helm shaped like a stag's skull, horns twisted into spirals. His chest bore the brand of a great eye with antlers. He howled, a bestial roar that shattered any pretense of humanity and leveled a jagged lance of bone. Theobald barely had time to pull Adelinde behind the ruined altar as the creature thundered past, shattering stone and flinging gore from its hooves. The lance missed by inches, embedding into a support beam and splitting it in two. Dust and splinters rained down. "We need to go," Adelinde snapped, reloading her pistol with trembling hands. Theobald nodded grimly. "You first." She fired one last shot. It struck the rider's shoulder, but the creature didn't slow. Blood hissed from the wound, but he remained upright, snarling. Theobald hurled a broken chunk of stone at the beast's head, stunning it for a second, just long enough for the two of them to sprint through a crumbling passageway. Behind them, hooves struck the flagstones with fury. The chapel collapsed partially as the rider gave chase, the structure failing under the strain. Stones fell. A wall gave out. They burst into the open, diving through a shattered arch, the forest yawning before them once again. The rider reached the arch just as it crumbled in a cascade of centuries-old rock. His mount shrieked, a sound of rage and torment, and was buried beneath tons of ancient stone. Theobald didn't stop running until the mist swallowed the ruins behind them. Only when they reached their horses, spooked and snorting, did they pause, breaths ragged, blades soaked. Theobald looked back toward Eisenwacht. The ground trembled faintly underfoot. The cult hadn't been destroyed, only scattered. The beast would dig itself out eventually. He sheathed grim hem, jaw clenched. "They're becoming more than men," he said. "They're becoming monsters." Chapter 5. Dreams of the Black Stallion. The moon hung like a pale, lidless eye over the Raikta wilds, its green-tinged glow bleeding through the crooked trees outside the hunter's cabin, where Theobald and Adelinde had taken refuge. The forest around them creaked and whispered like a living thing, shifting in the dark, leaves rustling with voices not made by wind. Inside, Theobald lay on a straw-stuffed cot, stripped of his armor but never fully at rest. His eyelids fluttered against the weight of exhaustion, yet sleep came like a poison, fast, cold, and unnatural. And then the dream began. He stood in a clearing, drenched in twilight, though no sun or moon lit the sky. The trees were dead things, ashen trunks twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches curled like claws, reaching for the void above. There was no wind, but the leaves trembled. There were no birds, but the air hummed with the rustle of unseen wings. Ahead of him stood Magnar, or what remained of him. The proud stallion's flanks were gaunt now, ribcage jutting beneath stretched, veiny skin. His once glossy black coat had sloughed away in patches, revealing muscle that pulsed and writhed like a bag of serpents. His legs bent backward, hooves split into jagged claws that dug furrows into the earth. Eyes that had once been gentle and intelligent now glowed crimson, twin coals of hate and torment. Smoke curled from his nostrils with each breath, and where his mane had been coarse, matted dreadlocks twisted with barbed wire and shards of bone. With reared screaming. From the shadows climbed his rider, a figure clad in patchwork hide and stitched skin, adorned with fetishes made from animal bones, rusted nails, and teeth both human and otherwise. His face was a warped approximation of a stag's skull, fused to his flesh, antlers cracked and encrusted with scabs. He bore a staff of writhing wood, the top crowned by a pulsating, lidless eye that tracked Theobald with malignant hunger. Magnar snorted and stamped, chains binding his neck and flanks. As the rider climbed upon the beast's back, the chains sunk into the stallion's flesh, drawn taut by invisible force, fusing mount and rider together. Where metal met flesh, tendrils of black rot crept outward, veins turning to vines, muscle merging with armor in a hideous synthesis of Daemon and steed. The sky screamed. Above them, the clouds split like infected skin. A rift yawned open, leaking putrid green light that poured down like slime. From it descended whispers, not words but feelings, agony, ecstasy, hunger, domination. The trees bled black sap as the rider raised his staff and spoke in a tongue older than man, his voice like gravel grinding against glass. A massive altar rose from the ground, obsidian and bone fused into a grotesque dais. Sprawled upon it were horse corpses, some still twitching, each mutilated, drained, and flayed to feed the ritual. The pulsating eye on the rider's staff burst open, and from it poured fire, black and oily, but alive, sentient, hungry. It sought Magnar's form like a lover, crawling into the horse's mouth, eyes, nostrils, burrowing beneath skin and bone. Magnar shrieked, a sound Theobald would never forget, not a cry of pain, a scream of rebirth. Then, abruptly, the stallion's head turned, locking eyes with Theobald. "Why did you let them take me?" came a voice inside his skull. It was Magnar's voice, but deeper, echoing with malice. "You left me in the dark. Now I will carry fire. You will burn, my knight." With a jolt, like being struck by lightning, Theobald awoke. He sat upright in the cot, drenched in sweat, heart pounding like a war drum. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the hearth. Outside, the wind howled like wolves circling a corpse. Adelinde sat nearby, sharpening her blade with slow, rhythmic strokes. She looked up, eyes sharp. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked, voice low. Theobald swallowed, his throat raw. "It wasn't just a dream, it was something else." "A vision," she said. "They're reaching into your mind now. It means the ritual has begun." He clenched his fists. "They've fused him to something, a demon. They're changing him, wrapping him in hate." Adelinde nodded grimly. "They bind demon essence into the flesh of noble steeds. It's a sacrament to them, to corrupt what is pure, to turn symbols of honor into weapons of desecration." "Where?" Theobald growled. "Where is the altar?" "There's a glade deep within the Drakwald," she said. "The Forest of Lamentations. It only appears on nights when Morsleib hangs low and sick in the sky, a wound in the world itself." Theobald rose, strapping his sword to his back. "And that's where we go," he said, "before they finish what they started." Outside, the night crept closer, and in the distance, somewhere deep in the woods, a single, monstrous hoofbeat echoed through the trees. Chapter 6. Blood on the Altar. The Drakwald swallowed them. By dawn the light had already begun to die beneath the oppressive canopy. Gnarled branches knit together above like a cage of antlers, blotting out the sky. The deeper they rode, the more the forest changed. Vibrant green turned to dull, bruised hues, and the trees bled sap that stank of rotted meat. Moss grew in unnatural shapes, forming patterns that squirmed at the edge of vision, and birdsong was absent, replaced by whispers that echoed without source. The party was 3 now. Sir Theobald Kruger rode at the front, his armor dulled with ash and old blood, eyes ever fixed on the path ahead. Beside him walked Adelinda Volkmar, her flintlock holstered, her blade naked in hand despite the distance they had yet to cover. And behind them, moving with uncanny ease through the underbrush, came Otto Grunwald, a scarred old woodsman whose left eye had been taken by a beastman years ago and replaced with a polished riverstone. "They say the forest hates the pure," Otto muttered as they passed under a stone arch, half swallowed by vines, engraved with imperial sigils now scored and defaced. "It can smell faith. It chokes it." "We'll give it plenty to choke on," Theobald said, jaw tight. They passed shrines, once holy, now mutilated. A statue of Tal had been decapitated, the head placed backward atop the stump. Children's skulls encircled its feet like an offering. A shrine to Raya had been flayed open, entrails nailed in floral patterns to its altar. Flies swarmed in thick black clouds, undeterred by the cold. Otto crouched and touched the dirt. "We're close. Hoofprints, barefoot tracks too, dozens, maybe more." They moved slower now, through brambles that grabbed at cloaks like greedy fingers, past trees with bark peeled away to expose veins that pulsed when touched, past carcasses of animals, stags and bears, gutted and hung from limbs like grotesque wind chimes, their mouths sewn shut and eyes scooped out. Each corpse bore the same sigil carved into its flank, an eye crowned with horn. The trail dipped suddenly into a hollow where the stench became unbearable. Otto raised a hand, signaling silence, and crept to the edge of a ravine that looked like a wound in the earth. Below, the cult had gathered. Dozens of figures moved in grotesque harmony, masked in horned skulls, feathers, and animal hides. Fires burned green and red, vomiting unnatural smoke that spiraled upward and did not disperse. Tents made of stretched hides formed a crude ring around a massive central altar, constructed of blackened stone and mortared with what appeared to be crushed bone. Blood pooled at its base, drawn in complex, swirling runes that steamed against the cold. And at the center stood Magnar, or the thing that had once been him. The steed was bound with iron chains to 4 posts, but he no longer resisted. His eyes glowed a fierce, unnatural crimson, and his body had mutated. Muscles bulged with warp taint, veins blackened and pulsing. Great spikes jutted from his spine. His mouth opened and closed in twitching spasms, revealing teeth far too sharp, too long. There was movement beneath his skin, as though something inside clawed to get out. Priests, or what passed for them, circled the altar. Their flesh was painted with ash and smeared with offal, their limbs stretched or broken and reset at impossible angles. One held a dagger made from a unicorn's horn, bleached and carved with foul sigils. Another poured blood over the altar from a gilded chalice made from a man's skull. Above them all stood the hierarch, a towering figure in a cloak made entirely from stitched-together horsehide, the faces of foals and mares still visible within the folds. His head was crowned with a mass of twisting antlers, and from his back rose 2 feathered appendages, neither wings nor limbs, but something in between. Adolindi breathed. "The unveiling." Otto spat. "That's no ceremony. That's a damn birthing." Theobald's hand clenched around his sword hilt. They mean to finish the transformation. As they watched, the hierarch raised both arms, and the cult fell into silence. The chanting ceased. Even the wind paused. A knife was brought forth. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, was dragged before the altar. His mouth had been sewn shut, his eyes swollen from crying. The dagger was lifted high. Theobald stood. "No," he growled. Adelinde caught his arm. "We'll be cut down before we reach the base. There are too many." "They're sacrificing a child to finish that thing," he snapped. Orton nodded grimly. "If we distract them, I can try to cut Magnar loose." Theobald looked at them both. "Then we bleed them," he drew grim him. The sound rang out, metal over scabbard, like the cry of a bell in a graveyard. They surged down the ridge. Theobald was a thunderclap. He slammed into the first cultist with a shoulder check that snapped the man's spine, spun, and took the head of another clean off. Blood sprayed the altar, hissing where it landed. Adelinde fired once, then twice, each shot dropping a priest mid-chant. Otto leapt from shadow to shadow, knife in hand, slashing at the chains that held Magnar. Chaos exploded. The cultists screamed and charged. Spears and jagged axes glinted. One rushed Theobald, swinging a flail of horse bones. The knight caught it on his pauldron, shattered the weapon with a parry, and buried his blade in the man's ribs, twisting until bone cracked and blood fountained. Adelinde slashed down a woman with antlers sewn into her scalp, only to be tackled by 2 others. She drove her boot into one's throat, crushing it, then pistol-whipped the other until his skull collapsed. The hierarch turned toward them, howling words that set the air on fire. The stone of the altar cracked. The blood boiled. Magnar reared, his eyes blazing with unholy light. Otto screamed. One of the chains had snapped, but not before it lashed across his chest, flaying skin and sending him tumbling. Still he drove his blade into the final shackle, shouting through bloodied teeth. Theobald reached the altar just as the hierarch descended. They clashed. The staff of the hierarch struck with unnatural force, cracking stone and denting steel. Theobald blocked, barely, and countered with a blow that sheared through the feathered appendage. The cult leader shrieked, not in pain, but rage. Magnar's final chain broke. The beast reared, his mouth opening in a scream that shattered the nearby tent poles and sent cultists stumbling back in terror. Fire poured from his nostrils, green, writhing and alive. Otto dove clear just in time. The hierarch turned to the steed, arms outstretched. "Magnar! Ascend!" The steed turned and trampled him. The altar cracked in half under the weight. Bones and stone exploded. The hierarch's body folded with a sickening crunch as every hoof landed. When it was over, he was no more than paste, his antlers still twitching. The cult began to scatter, but Magnar did not stay. With a shriek, he galloped into the trees, smoke trailing behind him like a banner of war. The camp was chaos, fires roaring, cultists fleeing or clawing at each other in madness. Theobald grabbed Otto, half-conscious, and with Adelinde covering their escape, they vanished into the forest shadows once more. Behind them, the altar burned. Blood boiled. The unveiling had been halted, but the beast had been loosed. Chapter 7. The Black Procession. The air was foul with incense and blood. Theobald crouched beneath a twisted pine at the edge of the ridge, his fingers gripping the rock until his knuckles whitened. Marshlibb, the accursed moon, hung swollen and leering in the sky, casting a sickly green pall across the forgotten valley below. Its light seemed to crawl over every surface, sliding along the stones and pooling in the low places like liquid madness. Geheimnisnacht, the witching night. when the veil between worlds thinned and horrors walked free. Below, the procession began. They came from the woods in droves, masked, naked, cloaked in skins, their bodies painted in dried blood and filth. 100 or more, swaying as one, chanting in a tongue that twisted Theobald's stomach. The sound was not quite human, low, guttural, vibrating with something primal and vile. Bone flutes and crude drums gave rhythm to their march. They carried torches made of femurs bound in sinew, flames guttering blue and green. The cult had gathered in full and moved toward the valley's heart, a long-forgotten ruin of broken statues and moss-covered obelisks. At its center, a massive stone platform jutted from the ground like a fang. Carved into its face were images of man and beast intertwined in scenes of transformation, sinew melting into fur, fingers stretching into claws, mouths widening into muzzles. Around it, tall wooden effigies of half-human creatures had been erected, limbs twisted and bloated, mouths sewn open in silent scream. And then came the steed. Theobald's breath caught. Magnar, but not Magnar. What emerged was a monstrosity in the shape of a horse. Its flesh was a patchwork of obsidian scales and exposed muscle, steaming in the cold air. Hooves had become talons, cracked and rimmed with brass. Spines jutted from its back in uneven rows, each wet with sap-like pus. Its eyes, now too large for its skull, burned with swirling warp light, and a forked tongue flicked from between yellowed carnivorous teeth. But what broke Theobald most was the way it still moved, majestically, with a soldier's grace. Despite its corruption, Magnar still marched with a noble gait, head high, nostrils flaring, a perversion of his once proud bearing. It was as though the Daemon that now puppeted him delighted in mocking the memory of valor. Upon his back rode a crowned figure. The rider wore armor of horn, leather, and warped metal, shaped not by hammer but by mutation. His shoulders were too broad, his arms too long, ending in clawed gauntlets. His helm was a stag's skull encased in rusted iron, fused to his face, with spiraled horns that reached to the stars. Chains hung from his belt, some attached to flayed torsos, still twitching. Atop his head sat a crown of bone, jagged and incomplete, still warm with blood. His very presence bent the air, and the cultists fell prostrate as he passed, sobbing, bleeding, mutilating themselves in ecstasy. From the crowd came a chant, whispered at first, then rising into a frenzied roar. "The Beastlord Ascendant, the Beastlord Ascendant." Theobald's heart thundered in his chest. The vision. The dream. It had come to pass. Atalende crouched beside him, her eyes locked on the scene with cold fury. Otto, still bandaged from the altar's collapse, watched in silence, face pale in the moonlight. The procession spiraled around the stone dais, where the Beastlord reined Magnar in. The steed let out a shriek, its voice no longer equine, a screeching blend of fury, hatred, and unholy joy. Flames burst from its nostrils, lighting the pyres beneath the effigies. Screams rose from the fires, real screams, not wood cracking. Victims had been bound within. The Beastlord stood in his stirrups and raised a twisted scepter of bone and brass. The cult fell silent. In that silence, the wind shifted, and Theobald heard his name, not shouted, not spoken, whispered, by every voice at once. Theobald. He flinched, stepping back, eyes wide. The procession hadn't stopped, but something had turned toward him. The Beastlord's head rotated, not smoothly but with a sickening crack, 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 bones realigning beneath corrupted flesh. Those burning red eyes, masked behind the stag's helm, locked with his. Magna reared, and for a moment, only a moment, Theobald saw a flicker. Recognition. A quiver in those eyes. A glimmer of the proud beast that once stood beside him, rain lashing their armor as they broke through the beastmen lines together. The cry that left the steed's throat then was pained, conflicted. Then the moment was gone. The Beastlord yanked the reins, and Magna obeyed without hesitation, spinning in a tight circle, flame streaming from his hooves. The chanting resumed. The Beastlord Ascendant. Theobald backed away from the ridge. "They know we're here," he whispered. Adalidi nodded grimly. "And they mean to finish the coronation?" Otto unslung his crossbow, loaded with a bolt etched in silver and blessed salt. "Then we give them their funeral pyre instead." Chapter 8. Trial by Iron and Flame. The ground trembled beneath them. Theobald led the descent into the valley like a thunderbolt given form, plate armor clattering with purpose, Grimham drawn and burning with the runes of oaths long sworn. Adelinde followed with a satchel of black powder charges, slung across her shoulder, her face a mask of grim resolve. Otto trailed behind, crossbow ready, a coil of fuses around his neck like a crown of thorns. The cult hadn't expected them to strike so soon. They moved like ghosts through the bone effigies and chanting lunatics, striking with speed and fury. The first wave of cultists fell without ceremony. Adelinde's pistol barked once, twice, and men crumpled with holes in their skulls. Theobald dismembered a shrieking acolyte with a single stroke, his blade shearing through flesh and spine as though slicing parchment. Then came the knights. They stepped from the base of the altar, 4 of them, warriors twisted by chaos, wearing once noble armor that had fused to their bodies. Their helms were fashioned into bestial visages, boar, raven, wolf, and stag. Their weapons dripped with warp-touched ichor, and from their joints hissed steam and black bile. Theobald faced them alone. The first, the boar knight, charged with a hammer the size of a tombstone. Theobald met him with a roar, parrying the swing with a shoulder turn, and slammed his pommel into the knight's jaw, shattering bone beneath steel. He followed with a low sweep that took the creature's knee and brought it to the ground, then decapitated it with a vicious, downward blow that sent black blood spraying across the altar steps. The wolf knight leapt like an animal, blades in both hands, snarling through jagged teeth. Theobald caught one blade on his vambrace and retaliated with an elbow to the throat that cracked vertebrae. They grappled, steel shrieking against steel, until Theobald broke free and ran the knight through, his sword erupting from the back with a gout of steaming gore. Meanwhile, Adeline darted between obelisks and sacrificial pillars, planting charges at the structure's base. The satchel hissed with alchemical fuses, and the scent of sulfur filled the air. She ducked a thrown axe and fired point-blank into the chest of a charging zealot. The blast blew him backwards into a burning effigy, his scream cut short by flame. Then the stag knight came for Theobald. This one was massive, towering over the rest, clad in fused bronze and sinew, with antlers carved from bone, lashed to his helm. His sword was a curved monstrosity, glowing with pulsing veins of warpstone. Every swing distorted the air with pressure. Theobald barely dodged the first strike. It carved a trench through the stone. He countered, landing 3 quick blows, shoulder, hip, ribs, but the knight barely reacted. The thing inside the armor no longer felt pain. The stag knight slammed into him with a bull's charge, sending Theobald crashing into a pillar. The wind was knocked from his lungs, his vision flecked with stars. As the knight lifted his blade for the killing blow, a bolt struck the creature's eye. Otto. From atop the altar's ridge, the old woodsman had taken a position, crossbow in hand. He fired again, reloading with a grunt. The second bolt took the stag knight in the throat. It stumbled, gurgling, and Theobald surged forward, driving Grimhim up through the gap in the gorget and out the back of the skull. The knight spasmed and dropped like a felled tree. But Otto's position had not gone unnoticed. Dozens of cultists turned, shrieking. Otto drew a long dagger from his belt and ignited the bundle of fuses draped over his shoulders. "For Sigmaril, you bastards!" he roared. He charged into the oncoming horde. The explosion that followed tore the air apart. A wave of fire, bone, and screaming cultists was hurled skyward, their bodies shredded into rain. The impact shook the earth. Adelinde shielded her face from the heat, eyes wet, mouth a silent curse. Theobald climbed the altar, step by blood-slick step. And then he came. Magnar. The steed thundered from the shadows, bearing no rider now. Its hide shimmered with warp light, a grotesque tapestry of scars and mutations. Its tail whipped like a flail, its legs ending in brass-shod claws. From its mouth spilled fire and rot. It locked eyes with Theobald. Something flickered. Pain, rage, recognition. Theobald raised his sword. The beast screamed and charged. The impact was titanic. Theobald rolled aside at the last moment, flames licking the altar as Magnar circled back. The beast moved with terrifying speed, hooves striking sparks. It leapt, jaws snapping, and Theobald swung. Steel met bone, and a chunk of Magnar's flank was torn free, revealing a writhing mass of tendrils beneath. Still, the creature pressed on. It slammed into Theobald, sending him flying. His back struck the stone, his vision blurred. Magnar reared, front legs poised to crush him, but he drove his sword upward into the beast's chest. Magnar shrieked, blood and ichor pouring down. He collapsed atop Theobald, pinning him. The knight gasped, struggling beneath the weight. He reached up, hand on the creature's ruined face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and for a heartbeat the eyes dimmed. Then Adelinde appeared, hauling Magnar's corpse off him with a chain and pulley from one of the fallen effigies. Theobald rose, covered in blood, armor scorched, breathing ragged. Adelinde pointed to the altar. "Now, we end it." He nodded. She lit the final fuse, and together they descended the steps. As they cleared the valley, the charges erupted. The altar split in two, fire roaring skyward like a god's wrath. Stone shattered, bones turned to ash, screams echoed, high and shrill, then were silenced. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but embers and silence. Chapter 9. Shattered Hooves. The flames hadn't died yet. The temple valley still smoldered. Its blackened bones curled like the carcass of some slain titan. Smoke billowed upward, thick and choking, veiling the stars and even Morsleb's grotesque leer. The wind howled with voices not its own, half sobs, half screams, echoes of a ritual aborted, a power denied its final breath. Sir Theobald Kruger stood amid the ruin, a monolith of blood-stained steel, chest heaving, Grimhim clenched in a fist that trembled with exhaustion. His armor was cracked and burnt, the edges of his surcoat scorched to tatters. Adelinde Bulkmar walked behind him, limping, her coat torn and slick with gore, her eyes sharp despite the wear. The altar was gone, blasted apart in a pyre of Sigmarite wrath, but at the heart of the shattered platform, something still moved. A low, wet noise, a scraping of iron on stone. Magnar, the creature that had once been the knight's warhorse, clawed its way forward from the smoldering rubble. The fire hadn't killed it. Not yet. It had burned the flesh, seared the warp-spun sinew, melted the iron talons that passed for hooves. But something within still clung to existence. Its form was ruined beyond recognition. Charred bone poked through patches of blackened hide. One eye socket was empty, the other glowed faintly red through a veil of ash and blood. Smoke hissed from open wounds, and its limbs jerked in spasms as if tugged by unseen strings. The stench was unbearable. Burnt meat and blasphemy. Adelinde raised her pistol. Theobald raised a hand. "No," he said. His voice cracked like dry stone. "This is mine." He stepped forward alone. Magnar lifted his head, as if sensing his master's approach. It made a sound, low and broken, not a whinny, not a snarl, but something in between. There was pain in it. Confusion. The warped tongue flickered from between scorched lips, and the twisted remnants of reins hung useless from its neck. Theobald knelt beside it, resting his gauntleted hand against what remained of its mane. The once sleek hair was gone, replaced with barbed coils, matted and oozing. Still, he stroked it gently. "You carried me through fire," he whispered. "Through battle and death. You never faltered, never feared. I owe you a death worthy of your loyalty." The eye looked at him, and, for a heartbeat, the crimson faded. For a moment, Theobald saw him again, Magnar, true and proud, standing atop the walls of Middenheim, nostrils flared and hooves striking sparks as the chaos horde broke against the gate. The stallion that had crushed skulls beneath his hooves and leapt fire pits without hesitation. His brother in arms. Then the glow returned. The beast shuddered and hissed, the demon's essence boiling just beneath the surface. Horns began to sprout anew, curling from the jawline. The muzzle split wider, the eye bled smoke. There was no time. Theobald stood and raised Grinmail. "I release you," he said, and brought the blade down. The strike cleaved through Magnar's neck with a sickening crack, thwack, splitting vertebrae and flesh. Black blood spurted in a steaming arc, and the creature spasmed violently, limbs thrashing, jaws gnashing at nothing. Then it stilled. The eye faded, and Magnar was no more. Adelinde stood silent behind him, head bowed. No words were spoken, no prayers given. The knight had performed the last rite that mattered. But the cost had not yet finished collecting. From the heart of the ruin, a fissure split the earth. The ritual's cancellation had left the power bound but unfocused, and it lashed out like a dying serpent. Runes carved into the stone glowed briefly before imploding inwards, and the temple's very foundation groaned like a beast in agony. The walls began to collapse. Stones tumbled. Obelisks toppled, smashing cult effigies into dust. "Theobald!" Adelinde shouted, reaching for him. He turned at the last second, leaping from the altar platform as it crumbled behind him. The earth swallowed what remained of the summoning dais. A rush of warp fire shot skyward, accompanied by a scream, not of any one person, but all of them, every soul that had bled upon that altar, every life twisted into service of the horned path. The sound was deafening, a banshee choir of rage, grief, and vengeance. Then, silence. The wind returned. Smoke thinned, and the valley, once a shrine to madness, was now only a grave. Theobald dropped to one knee, his sword buried in the earth beside him, armor sagging with the weight of grief. Adelinde stood guard at his side, scanning the dark trees beyond. Only ashes remained, stations, but within them, no shadows stirred. Chapter 10. Ashes and Oaths. Raikta stood as it always had, stone spires jutting from the hills like broken spears, the Reik River curling through the frost-hardened earth like a dark vein. Yet something had shifted. The air, once brisk with the sharp scent of pine and hearth smoke, now carried an undercurrent of unease. The townsfolk moved with hunched shoulders, eyes darting toward the distant forest, with fear that no longer needed explanation. Sir Theobald Kruger rode through the gates alone. His armor was polished once more, the blood scrubbed from its grooves, but no amount of steel could mask what clung to him now. The crowd had gathered, soldiers, nobles, even children, drawn to the spectacle of a hero's return. They saw the black cloak stitched with the sigils of victory, the battered blade at his hip, and the white horse he now led, new, unscarred, silent. But they also saw the eyes. Theobald's gaze had changed. It no longer burned with righteous fire, but simmered, low, cold, volcanic. The eyes of a man who had seen too much, who had killed not just beasts and heretics, but something of himself. Whispers curled like smoke behind his back. It was effective. He went into the Drakwald and returned. But at what cost? And his horse died, didn't it? Or something worse. I looked at me, just once, and I swear my heart skipped. At the citadel, a parchment bearing the imperial seal awaited him. Thanks from the Elector Count, honors bestowed, lands secured. The gold sat untouched. The medallion of valor remained in its velvet case. No ceremony was held. Theobald refused it all. He stood instead before the old chapel of Sigmar, kneeling in armor dented with memory. He prayed, but not for salvation, not for peace. He prayed for war. Inside the chapel, the walls bore the stories of saints, men who had died for the empire, not lived. Theobald stared at their faces, unmoving for hours. And when he emerged at dusk, he wore a new sigil stitched beneath his tabard. A broken hoof crowned with flame. Weeks passed. Snow fell over Reichstadt like a silken shroud, covering the ruins of burnt shrines near the town's border, where cultists had once dared to mark their path. Theobald tracked them now with obsessive precision, scraps of parchment covered in scrawled notes, patterns of hoofprints, blood trails, twisted prayers. He hunted them like vermin through frozen woods, finding dens of madness hidden beneath ruined crypts, in old barrows, deep caves behind frozen waterfalls, and always, always, he killed. Not quickly, not cleanly. He did not simply burn their icons, he shattered them. He broke their masks with mailed fists, crushed their altars underfoot, dismembered their leaders with the same practiced fury he'd once reserved for battlefield execution. One night, he returned to Krugerhalt with his armor streaked in black blood, dragging behind him a sack filled with bones carved in spiraling runes. He dumped them on the floor of the war room without a word. The guards no longer met his eyes. In the shadows, Adelinde Volkmar watched. She remained in Reichstadt, though few ever saw her. When she appeared, it was at the edges, on rooftops, behind windows in alleyways that stank of rust and cold. She observed the night like a scholar studying a burning scripture. Knew the way his fingers twitched at the sight of hooves, how he flinched when a horse neighed too close, how he woke at night with a start, eyes glowing faintly in torchlight. She noted the marks he'd carved into his blade's pommel. Tallies. Dozens. Once she entered his chambers without sound. On the table sat a parchment, ink still fresh. Not a letter. A list. Fragments of the Horn Path's remaining covens. There were 8 names, all marked for death. On the wall he had drawn an altar, a replica of the one in the valley. Above it, nailed like a trophy, was the broken bridle of Magnar. Burned, blackened, but preserved. His eyes lingered on it often, with a look that was not mourning, not love, obsession. Adelinde stepped from the shadows, her pistol drawn, but aimed low. "You're not done, are you?" Theobald did not turn. "No," he said. "I swore an oath." "To what?" "To vengeance," he said. "To purity. To fire. And if that fire consumes you," his voice was like the grinding of a millstone, "then I burn with it." She watched him for a long time, the silence stretching like wire. Then she turned and left without a word, her coat trailing behind her like smoke. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, Theobald lifted his sword and carved another name from the list.